180 degrees. Why? This is a stupid rule. So you think you're exposing correctly because you think 180 degrees is the right duration. It's degrees? That's a stupid rule. It comes from when these cameras were... This is an AK-16, the peaceful version. Let me show you. There is a little wheel in here. It's a segmented wheel, so it has an opening that passes by the opening where the light goes through and hits the film. Through the lens, onto the film. And this wheel, at some point, is opening and then closing again. While it's closed, and while the light doesn't go through the lens onto the film, the camera puts 2 fingers in the perforation and moves the film for a few millimeters. And while it's open, the film gets exposed. And with this knob, this is fully open and this is closed. Now you can't see through, and now you can. Now you can't, and now you can. I can change this from fully open to absolutely shut. Now no light goes through, and now it's fully open. Now already here in this camera, which is pretty old, it's not 180 degrees because the wheel has 2 segments, as you can see. So even if it's written 180 degrees here, it just means it's the maximum time of exposure for the film. That maximum time was half the duration of a frame. So if you had 24 frames per second, that made it a 48th second. And strange enough, that around 50th was long enough that something that moved in front of the camera would blur. But it doesn't really matter how often you do this in a second. You can do this 24 times or 50 times. There is a certain limit to it. This is old technology. That camera is a few hundred years old. Somebody took it from the grave of Akhenaten, I guess. Maybe it was in a box somewhere and nobody was looking at it for a long time. I've been using this. This is 60 millimeters, but it doesn't change the concept. 180 degrees just means half of the time the sensor, the film, is not exposed. And the other half, it is exposed. And accidentally, this is a 50th. This is when things still look in focus when you look at them. And if they move, they're kind of blurry, motion blur. Now, if you double the frame rate to get this 180 degrees rule right, when you're filming with 50 or 60p, you're only exposing it 100th of a second or 120th of a second. That's too short. You won't get any motion blur with that. And when they declared the 180 degrees rule, nobody was thinking about more than 32 frames per second at maximum of 16, 20, 24 and 32 frames per second. And it makes a lot of noise then. And most times the film rips because it's just too fast. If you're exposing 120 frames per second at a 120th, which you can now, because nowadays you don't have the rotating disc with the opening, so you could do 360 degrees. That was impossible then because you had to, fingers, film, perforation, move the film. All that had to happen in the other half of the frame. Now think about it. If a 50th of a second was enough to blur the motion, if you're filming at 120 frames per second and you double this to a 250th of a second exposure time, there will be no motion blur. It will be shuttery. And if you then slow down your slow motion, there won't be any motion blur. Maybe there isn't any because things are not moving fast enough, but If there would be, maybe it would look a little softer. Think about that. Expose every frame with the right exposure time. There's no need to just follow a stupid rule somebody came up when the cameras weighed like 20 kilos. Now those small little sensors, you can expose them as long as you want. As long as you're staying within the realm of your frame rate. Just rethink the concept of exposing the sensor of your camera with the image you're filming. If a 50th allows you a nice motion blur, then go with a 50th. And if you're doing this 50 times a second, is that so bad? If you're exposing it 100th because somebody came up with a rule, it makes no sense to stick to a rule that was invented when cameras had rotating discs inside. So start thinking and don't just follow rules because people chew them up every day on YouTube. And you people out there on YouTube re-chewing the 180 degrees rule, rethink the concept how you're exposing the sensor in your camera on a logical basis. If you need motion blur, expose every frame with the exposure time that is needed to create motion blur. Like motion blur, a 50th is fine. If you're doing this 50 times a second, it's also fine. You don't have a turning wheel in there. You don't have a huge ass motor on it. Subscribe to this channel if you want to see more geeky stuff about cameras, and perhaps next time I'm talking about projections again. Until then, I'll see you next time.